Hello, everyone, and thank you all so much for coming today. Can people hear me okay? All right, great. So my name is Tom Hoyser, and I'm president of the Capitol Hill Historical Society. I'm very excited to be co-presenting this event with Elliott Bay and University of Washington Press, particularly because it's been a subject of interest to some friends of mine recently, and we've been talking about the parks quite a bit, and also with it taking place so shortly after the historic protests and occupation in and around Cal Anderson Park. So it should be pretty fascinating to consider the park's development through this lens as well. But before we get started, though, I just wanted to share a little bit about CHHS. For those who don't already know about us, we are an all-volunteer-run nonprofit organization founded in 2017, whose mission is to gather, preserve, and share the history of the communities that have shaped Capitol Hill. We are funded by amazing organizations like For Culture, neighborly businesses such as Hunter's Capital and Marvin Anderson Architects, our membership and individual donors. In the past few years, we have successfully advocated for historic buildings such as the Broadway Apartments, many others in partnership with our friends at Historic Seattle. We republished the only book devoted exclusively to the history of Capitol Hill, titled The Hill with a Future by Jackie Williams. We've done numerous lectures, walking tours, and are currently conducting a survey of mid-century modern apartments, among many other activities. If you wish to learn more about us, you can visit our website at capitolhillpass.org or email us at info@capitolhillpass.org. And now I finally have the honor of introducing Jennifer Ott, who will be talking about her book, Olmsted in Seattle, Creating a Park System for a Modern City, with a focus today on Olmsted's parks in Capitol Hill. Jennifer is an environmental historian and assistant director of HistoryLink, the free online encyclopedia of Washington State history. She has served on the board of the Friends of Seattle's Olmsted Parks and the Volunteer Park Trust Steering Committee, and is editor and co-author of Seattle at 150, Stories of the City Through 150 Objects from the Seattle Municipal Archives, and co-author of Waterway, the story of Seattle's locks and ship canal, all available for purchase online at elliottbaybook.com. Jennifer's talk today will run approximately 30 to 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A. We encourage attendees to submit their questions in the chat box at any time. And now let's welcome Jennifer Ott with a hearty wave or round of silent applause. I know you're not on video, but you can be giving applause here, and we will imagine you giving applause.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you to EW Press and to Elliott Bay Book Company for making this possible also. And I'm so happy to see all the people in the attendees box. I've missed talking to people. It seems like since we can't do our walking tours this year and I haven't been able to do many book talks for the last few months, I have missed you all. So thank you so much for taking some time out of your Sunday afternoon. And I hope that I do this. I practice to make this nice and smooth, but I will be talking for about 40 minutes. And then I look forward to your questions. I see some familiar faces on the attendees list that might know some of this story, but I see lots of new faces. So I'm excited to hear what you're interested in. But I'm going to give an overview of the park system as a whole and how we got an Olmsted Park system. And then I'm going to talk about the parks on Capitol Hill and their very short versions of their histories, and then talk about sort of the life of the park system after the original work was done by the Olmsted Brothers. And then we'll go to questions. So I'm going to share my screen so you all can see the PowerPoint. Oh, sure. Always the awkward silence while it gets going. So let's see. There we go. So Olmsted in Seattle is a book that I worked on the last few years. And I've been involved with Olmsted Parks in Seattle for about 13 years since I got involved with the commemoration of the centennial of the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition in 2009. And the thing that drew me to it is that as an environmental historian, it's really interesting to see how people shape the landscape that they live in, but also how communities are shaped by the landscape they live in. And Seattle likes to move its dirt and dig its channels and do all of that sort of massive, very apparent civil engineering types of work. But they also, we as a city have done some pretty significant work in developing parks where the human hand on the landscape is less apparent, very intentionally, but it's still just as engineered and planned as any civil engineering project. And so we'll talk about sort of what went into this first real urban planning effort in Seattle as we go through talking about the park systems development. So Seattle grew into a real town in the 1890s. We had about 40,000 people in 1890. And so we were no longer just an outpost of American expansionism, but we were actually coming into our own as a trading center. And Seattleites really wanted to be considered a real city. And one of the ways that they knew they needed to, one of the things they needed to do that is to have a park system. And the problem is that the city was growing in fits and starts, lots of boom and bust cycles, but they know that if they're going to attract that sort of long-term development, that they need to have a park system. There's a really interesting quote in the newspaper in the 1880s where a civic leader says that if we don't figure out how to have a beautiful place to live, then people will make their money here and then leave, because they know that people don't want to necessarily stay in a place that is always kind of makeshift and rough. And so you'll see this quote here at the bottom of the screen. It's, parks are the breathing lungs and beating hearts of great cities, and in them are whispers of peace and joy. And that's from the 1892 annual report of the park commissioners, which is really interesting. I would not have expected to find in that 1892 annual report such poetic language. And they know that they need these parks because they have been watching very closely, and many of them have recently moved from cities on the East Coast where landscape architects, particularly Olmsted, Frederick Law Olmsted Sr., had been working on developing parks and park systems. And so the idea for a park system traces back to after the Olmsted and Vaux, his Calvert Vaux was Olmsted's partner. After they finished doing Central Park and Prospect Park, they wrote a letter to the, in the Board of Park Commissioners report that they created for 1868 for Brooklyn. And in it, they said that having something like Central Park is not sufficient, or Prospect Park, because it's too far away from the majority of the people that need it the most, those people that could not escape to country homes in order to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city. And so they wrote that in addition to parks, very soon, the present street arrangements of every large town will at no very distant day require, not to be set aside, but to be supplemented by a series of ways designed with the express reference to the pleasure with which they may be used for walking, riding, and the driving of carriages, for rest, recreation, refreshment, and social intercourse, and that these ways must be so arranged that they will be conveniently accessible from every dwelling house and allow its occupants to pass from it to distant parts of the town. As for instance, when they want to go to a park, without the necessity of traveling for any considerable distance through the street no more convenient for the purpose than our streets of the better class now are. So he's saying there that, or they're saying there, that it's not sufficient to give just people city streets, even if they're nice city streets. What you need is a parkway system. And so it's going to be, I love it because they call them attenuated parks. They're those threads of park land that thread through the city, so no one is ever very far from access to park land and that aesthetic experience. And so in Brooklyn, you get the Ocean and Eastern Parkways as a result of that work that they did with the Brooklyn Board of Park Commissioners. And then in that same year, 1868, they developed the first public park system, Olmsted and Vaux did, for Buffalo, New York. And that park system is still intact. It's remarkable and it's beautiful. And it captures this idea that you have parks at very specific places as large as possible, but you connect them with these parkways. Another important thing that they were influenced by in the 1890s, civic leaders in Seattle, is that they knew about the Columbian Exposition, which was held in Chicago in 1893, and Frederick Law Olmsted did the landscape plan for it. And it was called the White City. And that was in reference to the buildings that were the temporary buildings that were made out of white plaster. But what they were doing with this plan is they were showing the United States, all the visitors to this fair, that you could plan a city, that it didn't just have to be functional. You didn't just have to have industry wherever it made sense to have industry, and housing fit in wherever it fit. But you could design a landscape where the streets were beautiful and the buildings' architecture was monumental, and you could interlace it with parks and water features. And as a result, you would have a more orderly city. And that's not, the goal was not just because that would be nice, it was because it would be, it's essential for the health of the democracy. If you're going to have a country like we have, where everyone is engaged with the political process, of course, at that time, some people were excluded, but if they're looking at the democracy to function, they need to have people who are healthy, not just in body, but also in mind. And so when Frederick Law Olmsted wrote a report about the Yosemite National Park idea in the, sorry, I just got a weird sign. Okay, I'm gonna make sure I wasn't messing something up. And so they, sorry, let me get my place. So when he writes the report for Yosemite National Park in 1865, he writes, "It is a scientific fact that the occasional contemplation of natural scenes of an impressive character, particularly if this contemplation occurs in connection with relief from ordinary cares, change of air, and change of habits, is favorable to the health and vigor of men, and especially to the health and vigor of their intellect, beyond any other conditions which can be offered them, that it not only gives pleasure for their time being, but increases the subsequent capacity for happiness and the means of securing happiness." So the idea is that you need to have access to beauty and to nature in order to be a really well-functioning human, and so voter. It's interesting though, this idea that you will need access to beautiful places is the first, and the idea that you can create landscapes within cities, it's the first time that you see that heavy-handedness, so the landscape management of sort of a paternalistic attitude that the planners knew best. And we know from history that's been done subsequent to Olmsted's work that Seneca Village in Central Park was a community of Black people who were, it was a bit of a hodgepodge. They were poor and they were sort of making the best out of the situation they were in. And Olmsted looked at that and said, no, that needs to be taken off of this landscape, and not a lot of concern was shown for where those people would then resettle. They were left to just be pushed out of a space. And the Central Park being developed. And it was sort of the ends justified the means sort of attitude. Although honestly, I don't know how much energy they even spent worrying about the means. And so this is the first thing that you'll see with urban planning. And this goes up to the more recent past with urban renewal. And that attitude that the greater good justifies the clearing of spaces. And so it's something to consider that they have very lofty goals, but at this time, those people who were most able to kind of have decisions made about where they live are the people that are in the decision-making position in the community. So as great as this idea was, and people were very smitten by the White City at the World's Fair, it is followed almost immediately by the crash, the Panic of 1893, which brings economic development to an absolute screeching halt. Seattle was no less affected by this because of its distance from the East Coast. And things here just go into the doldrums for the 1890s. In Seattle, though, we were rescued from this fate by the gold rush, the Klondike Gold Rush of 1897. And these are boxes of gold, not bags of gold, which I always think of, you know, the gold seekers coming back from Alaska with their bag of gold or their big nugget. They were coming back with boxes of gold. And so you have this massive influx of capital and of population. And that is something that really kicks off the ability of the city to start carrying out with some ideas that they have and start actually making things happen. The lack of capital and the lack of people had really frustrated Seattle's efforts in the past. And so the population growth you see in this era is we have about 43,000 people in 1890. We have 80,000 in 1900. And by 1910, we have 237,000. And so it's just this massive influx of people. And you see the development of subdivisions, you see industry growing, you see transportation systems being put into place, particularly streetcar lines. And you just see general city building, roads, bridges, railroads. And civic leaders really realize that a window of opportunity is closing, because if you think about it, if it's a textile mill gets built, then it is not going to be torn down to make a park. And so they know that as these subdivisions are being built, that they're losing the opportunity to purchase land either at all or for a reasonable price. And so Seattle had a handful of parks. These are the public parks: Woodland Park, Kinnear Park, and Denny Park by 1900. And they also had some private parks, Leschi and Madison and Ravenna. And so there are places where people can get away, but not in the scale that a city, they're anticipating a city of 500,000 people. And there's nowhere near enough parkland at that point. And so the Board of Park Commissioners tries to start getting the ball rolling, but it's an incredibly dysfunctional group. And they're mostly there for patronage positions. The mayors have given them the position to be on the board as a thank you for help with political campaigns. And so you see them there's actually in one year, 1901, there are 2 annual reports written by the 2 active park commissioners, and they are contradicting each other, and one accuses the other of corruption. So nothing's getting done. And so in 1901, the entire board, except for one hold on, was changed over. And the difference is that the people that were appointed were there specifically to get a park system developed. And they were wealthy white business owners and professionals. They were people that were used to planning projects, and they were people used to telling people what to do and having it get done. And so they were able to work with the park superintendent, they were able to work with the city council. They were of the same economic class as the city council and other large property owners in the city. And so they could do that sort of behind the scenes socializing and influencing to get things done that was key in that era. And there wasn't really a public process other than voting on bond issues. There was not really a public process for city planning at that point. And so that Board of Park Commissioners puts an article into the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, and that newspaper was a huge supporter, along with the Times, but really the Post-Intelligencer was key to getting public support behind the idea of a park board, of a park system. And it's interesting, one of the quotes from this article is that their goal was to hire a professional expert, that's very much of this progressive era, hire an expert to do the work. And they want that person to have they want that person to develop a park system, and then they want to have all future work done in harmony with that scheme, whether done now or 100 years from now. So the idea is that they're looking at how can we identify the pieces of land that we need so that 100 years from now, with a city of 500,000, we will have enough parkland and the right parkland for having a healthy city. And right about this time in the early 1900s, the rest of the country is sort of waking up from the panic of 1893, and there's lots of activity being done on park systems. And so the Board of Park Commissioners looks east for their expert, because often in Washington and Seattle history, we look east for the sort of stamp of approval that if it's from the East Coast, then it's already been vetted, and it must be the best of and the most up-to-date expertise. And so, of course, if they're looking for a landscape architect in the 1900s, they get Frederick Law Olmsted is the first name that comes to mind. He was known as the father of landscape architecture. He helped establish the first principles of design that are still, many of them are still in use today. And he had decades of work that people had heard about and that he had carried out. He had been joined by his son, John Olmsted, in the firm that he ran, and they worked together for several decades before Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. retired. And John Olmsted joined with his stepbrother and actually also his cousin. Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. is the uncle and stepfather of John C. Olmsted, who he married his brother's widow. And so the two brothers form the firm Olmsted Brothers, and they start doing work all across the country. And so in 1903, when Seattle is able to hire them, John Olmsted is the Olmsted that comes to Seattle. I like to call him our Olmsted because it gets a little confusing with all the different Olmsteds. And so what they get when they hire the Olmsted Brothers is they get a whole series of these design principles, an entire body of work that precedes the work that they do in Seattle. The one here that this postcard is such a great example of is the genius of place. And that is putting the access of the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition. This is the court of honor from that World's Fair. And you see that Mount Rainier is lined up with that axis. And so he took advantage of the natural environment, that particular place with that particular view, and made that the centerpiece of his design. The others I'll just go through really quickly is orchestration and movement is how you move people through a landscape. A comprehensive approach is looking at the park as a whole, but also the context in which the park exists. That's a really important one for Capitol Hill parks. The orchestration of use is that you make sure that the spaces that are assigned to different uses, whether they be passive or active, that those make sense adjacent to each other. Unified composition means that you look at the park design as a whole, or the landscape design as a whole, and make sure the pieces all work together. And then the last is sustainable design and environmental conservation. Olmsted would not have used those words, but that is the effect of an Olmsted plan, because what he's looking for, what they were looking for, were designs that could survive and flourish on their own, that they didn't require fussy tending. You didn't put ornamentals from the tropics in an outdoor park in Seattle. That's an extreme example, but you do things that make sense for the place where they are, which has the long-term effect of making them sustainable and has the effect of making them more environmentally sound. And so in 1903, Olmsted brings his plan to the Board of Park Commissioners for the city's park system. And this is the only version we have of it. He says in his letters that he delivers a map, but we were never able to find that. But this was published in the Post-Intelligencer in October 1903 as the City Council was considering adopting it. And you can see that the parks ring the downtown, and that is because already the downtown core is too densely developed and, too expensive for them to really consider buying that much land in that downtown core. But you do see how there are large parks. Those are the cross-hatched areas. You can see in the southern corner, I'm not sure if you can see my arrow, but I hope you can. In the south end, there's Seward Park, kind of juts off to the right. And Jefferson Park is that big rectangle. And then if you look up north, you can see Green Lake. He identifies those big parks, Woodland Park, Ravenna Park, and then he connects them with the boulevard system. You can see those kind of snaking around. And then the last component is the small parks. You can see those dotting the landscape. Not all of them are included on this map. And the idea there is that those are places for neighborhoods for people to gather and close to their homes. And so those are the three elements to the park system that he develops, and the Board of Park Commissioners and the City Council adopt it. And so on Capitol Hill, what we see is that we have a parkway from Washington Park to Volunteer Park. And just notice how it comes up the hillside. This is the north end of Capitol Hill, and it loops around and goes up the shoulder of the hill and then turns east into Volunteer Park. And so the parkway would have entered at the Highland Drive entrance that's there today. Volunteer Park, of course, right there in the middle, and then Lincoln Playfield, which is, I'm sorry, the blue box has disappeared. The Lincoln Park is here, Lincoln Playfield. It has so many names. It doesn't have an official name for quite some time. And so those are the three landscapes that Olmsted called for in that 1903 plan for Capitol Hill. In 1908, they invite Olmsted back. He's been working on different elements of the park system in the meantime, but they invite him in 1908 to develop another comprehensive plan that will incorporate those annexed areas to the north and south of downtown that were added in the 1900s after his original plan. And so places like South Park, West Seattle, Ballard, all those areas that were not part of the city in 1903, he incorporates them into the plan. And you can see again those large parks, the parkways connecting them, and the small parks dotting the landscape. In 1910, the Park Board invites Olmsted to develop a playground report. I hope everyone's getting a nice chuckle out of this playground equipment. I just love this picture. It was a different expectation for child safety in that time. And the playground report addressed the need for play fields for older kids. The park reports he'd already done addressed those smaller parks that would have playgrounds for small children, things like merry-go-rounds and little swings, and he called them little folks lawns that were areas for small children to play. But they needed places where they could have ball fields for older kids that would not knock the balls into the surrounding houses or buildings. And so the 1910 report addressed that need. And so by 1913, we have a pretty well-developed park system. In the upper left corner here, this is Lake Washington Boulevard at Coleman and Washington Park. I'm sorry, Coleman and Mount Baker Parks. And then in the upper right corner is the view from Washington Park off across the lake. In the lower left corner is Interlochen Boulevard on the north side of Capitol Hill. And in the lower right is Volunteer Park. That is the concourse in the original pergola and concert grove there on the right. And they concentrated this early work in the rapidly developing areas. They only had so much money to work with. They did get some park bonds passed, but still they had a limited budget. And so they focused on those areas where they needed to get land before it was developed. Pretty much once something was subdivided, not always, but pretty much once it was subdivided, it was very, very hard to get parkways through those areas. They also looked at places where the economic goals of the Board of Park Commissioners, the City Council, and business leaders would be realized. And so those were places where there was lots of residential development going in, places where streetcar lines were running, places where when they did the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition, that they could show off the beauty of the city most effectively. The Board of Park Commissioners did a huge rush to get Lake Washington Boulevard developed from Mount Baker Park to the university campus, because they wanted people to approach the campus from that direction, approach the World's Fair that way. The World's Fair was at the UW campus. And the idea is that they would fall in love with this place and they would move here. That's the whole reason you have a World's Fair, is to attract development and settlement. And that was certainly true of the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition. And And so you see a pattern of development and a pattern of where money is spent based on that. You also see in the Board of Park Commissioners minutes, it's really interesting. You see improvement clubs, which were essentially neighborhood booster clubs. And it's the people that would buy lots early in neighborhoods like Rainier Beach or South Park or Ballard, and they wanted to get the park board to spend money in their neighborhood. And so they would petition for specific projects, often offering to donate land in order to get those projects developed. It was sometimes effective and sometimes not, depending on the budget of the park board at that particular time. And so this is a map from 1909 that I like to kind of take a look at, because the dotted lines you see are the things that they are hoping to do. The solid lines, the solid black, are the things that are done. And so you see that by 1909, they've got a nice core of development along Lake Washington and over to the university. And Woodland Park, which had been a private park, is pretty well developed. But other than that, it's coming pretty slowly. And so I wanted to talk about sort of the different things beyond just what I talked about that determined where things would be developed. And as sort of the priorities I found in my research were that if there was existing development, they couldn't develop there. That's what you see, such a gap of service in the downtown core. If the developers, rather than just the homeowners in an area, but if the developers worked with the Board of Park Commissioners, they would donate the land to promote settlements and purchases. But it was a much cleaner transaction, and it seemed to be that the developers knew a lot of the people on the park board, and so things went a little more quickly. Cowan Park is a good example of that. The board of, if it was land already owned by the city, which is almost all of those big parks, Volunteer Park, Jefferson Park, some land on Queen Anne, Washington Park, those were all already owned by the city. And so they would they would develop it for park purposes, or at least a portion of it. You see on Jefferson Park there that it has that diagonal. It took quite a while for the city to give all of its land on that parcel to the park department. They kind of did it in stages. The Board of Park Commissioners had their priorities. They wanted to shape development in the city and attract newcomers, but they also wanted to ensure that the core building blocks were put into place and the things they had more flexibility with could wait. And then another huge priority, the one that sort of won over a lot of arguments over where and when, were open space for children. They wanted playgrounds for children as quickly as possible. And interestingly, going back to that idea of shaping the moral character and promoting moral health that we talked about at the beginning, you see that with the playgrounds. They were often staffed, and the goal of them was to sort of promote the mental and the moral well-being of the children that were playing in those parks. So this is the park system today, give or take a little bit. And you'll see that one of the goals Olmsted had was to have a park within a half mile of every house and a play field for older kids within a mile of every house. And it was largely realized, particularly if you look at those areas that were annexed before the 1950s when Olmsted was working here. And the parkways are a big exception. You'll notice how few, especially in the southern end of the city and also in Ballard, how few of those were developed. They just really proved difficult to develop. And there is a perception that Olmsted, the park system, is elitist, that it is most developed in the wealthier parts of the city. And there is some truth to that, but it's an interesting juxtaposition of elements. So the biggest park and the most well-developed parkway, Lake Washington Boulevard, are in the highest value properties areas of the city. But the parks and parkways were placed there because of the genius of place, that principle that I talked about, where they're capturing the most spectacular views. And that whole slope going over to, looking over Lake Washington. And so these would have been the most expensive places in Seattle anyway. The parks and the park system development provides public access to those places. So I often joke that I could never afford view property in Seattle, but I can go to a lot of Olmsted landscapes and enjoy the spectacular views we have in the city. One thing that I think shapes people's perceptions is that the parks in those parts of the city were the most completely developed according to Olmsted plans. They were not just recommended and located by Olmsted as part of the park system plan, but he did actual landscape plans, and they have been the most protected from change. And so I think that we go to a park like Washington Park and it feels Olmstedian, more so than say a playfield, Rainier Playfield. And so it feels like the Olmsted system has been more developed in that wealthier part of the city, and more of the Olmsted design principles have been maintained there, but the park system itself is fairly well distributed. It's interesting if you compare, say, the design of Volunteer Park with Rainier Playfield or Schmitz Park or Carkeet Drive and Beacon Avenue, that amazing link of Parkway, even though it's not officially a park boulevard. I encourage you to drive that sometime. It's just spectacular drive. Jefferson Park, the Ballard Playfield, they're all Olmsted, but they're not as well preserved with the Olmsted vision and elements. Also, the parkways that were not developed, it's most noticeable south of Seward Park, where the boulevard no longer goes along the lake shore. That was because the people who owned that property refused to go along with that plan. They wanted the parkway to turn inland there. And also, if you look at the Dormish River Valley and West Seattle and in Ballard, those areas did not have property developers who were urging the parkway's development. I didn't see any petitions by them before the park board for these years. And once the land was subdivided and sold, the chance was gone. You also see a similar dynamic to why the waterfront and Pioneer Square areas don't have parks. Other priorities won out there. Economic development always won in the Olmsted's arguments. He actually proposed several waterfront parks that would have been amazing, but that the warehouse owners and the railroads and other property owners just did not want to see it develop for parks. And so that had the effect of reinforcing the lower residential property values, because who wants to live next to a factory or an active warehouse? And so you have that reinforcement of patterns that are already happening. If you have a park and it gets developed, it reinforces higher property values. And the more it is Olmstedian, the more that that's true. And the higher the property values, the more well-developed the parks were in design. And this is, again, who's making decisions and who has the ear of the Board of Park Commissioners. There's also a more subtle reinforcement of this pattern. This is the earliest urban planning in Seattle, and one of its goals was to limit the haphazard, low-value housing that dotted the landscape. There were a lot of small homes on hillsides in Seattle that were not well-developed houses. They were fairly thrown together kinds of residences. And Olmstedian design principles reinforce that replacement of that type of housing with higher cost housing by recommending single family housing alongside parks and parkways and encouraging them to have large setbacks. And so that requires more property. And so those two things translate into a higher cost per home. And it limited who could purchase the houses, even though there weren't any restrictive covenants when Olmsted was here. The neighborhoods often had restrictive covenants later added to their deeds, but that was a desire to keep the higher end neighborhoods white only. And this could have been mitigated by adding higher density housing even one block off the parkways or the parks. And so you still would have had access for lower cost housing closer to the parks. But city and civic leaders were not concerned with mixing incomes in neighborhoods like that. That was not something that was part of the discussion. And also, when you see later public housing developments come to Seattle, those were generally put where residential land values were lower, which meant that they were farther away from parks. And so you have a lot of things going on that are reinforcing these patterns where higher income and higher value homes are closer to the parks. The mandatory housing affordability policy worked to mitigate this and address this, but The trick is doing it carefully, because everyone deserves some place that is beautiful to live. And so to put a multi-story building right on the boulevard, if it's not done carefully, can really detract from the boulevard experience. And so it's been interesting watching that process evolve. And I hope that it's not lost on planners that everyone deserves to have a place that's adjacent to a beautiful landscape. And we can be clever about how we do that so that we achieve both goals. So looking at Capitol Hill, I know I'm going to run a little bit long. I'll keep this moving. We have the 1903 plan here on the left, which was fairly simple. It has those 3 landscapes identified for Capitol Hill. But the 1908 report had several added. It had Roanoke Park, the Parkway to Washington Park. You see how that's been changed so it doesn't swoop around the hill. It stops at Roanoke Park. And then you have Boren Park, which is that viewpoint next to Lakeview Cemetery. And you have Volunteer Park, of course, Lincoln Playfield, and Miller Playfield, which is a little bit further east there. So the first one I want to talk about is the Parkway to Washington Park. The idea there was that it would swoop around the hillside, provide views along the way. This is the bicycle path that had been developed as part of a bike path system in Seattle in the 1890s. And Olmsted used some of those bike paths for their route. For this particular road, the frustration that the park board had was that before they could develop the layout of the road, they hired George Cotterill as city engineers to do that. The land was subdivided and it just got too expensive. And so they had to truncate it, and they took it over to Roanoke Park, but they also went straight up the hill in that very tight, curvy road that we know today in order to get to Volunteer Park by from the east side. And so technically the route is Interlochen Boulevard to 19th to Highland Drive over to the park. And so that is the intended route of the Park Boulevard after they realized they would not be able to do the plan that they wanted to do. Interlochen Boulevards is an important one because it was developed early, and Olmsted was in Seattle, and the park board asked him to take a look at it and give them his feedback, because often what he would do is recommend and locate landscapes, and then the city engineers and the park superintendent would carry them out. He sometimes would get a little frustrated with how efficient the engineers were. It's the most backhanded compliment. He called them, aren't they efficient? But instead he wanted them to be inefficient. He wanted them to swoop along the topography. And in that letter that he wrote, we get a good sense of what he envisioned for the parkway system. In a ravine like this, and think of Cheesty Boulevard, Carkeek Drive, Schmitz Parkway in West Seattle, these are places that go through the wooded areas. He wanted to see native vegetation as much as possible alongside the road. He wanted rustic furnishings and structures. So you see this bridge is basically made from peeled logs. That would be replaced by cement because they did not last very long. And then he wanted to see it meander and follow the topography as much as possible. This is in contrast to Montlake Boulevard and Green Lake Boulevard, both of which he gave design input on, and he saw them as much more formal. There have trees planted along the sides that are ornamentals, not native trees. They have, they're linear, they're very deeply separated divisions. There was supposed to be one lane for commercial traffic, one lane for pleasure driving. And then also he was really frustrated over and over again in these parkways when the engineers did not include sidewalks, when they did not invest in sidewalks, because he really wanted all of the landscapes to be accessible via cars, horses, feet, or bicycles. And so if you don't have a sidewalk, as we all know, it makes it much harder to make accessible for all users. The next one I'll talk about is Roanoke Park here up in the north end. That was it was purchased by the city in 1900 after a scandal with the city treasurer left it in the city's ownership, and they transferred it to the Parks Department in 1908 for this specific use as a terminus for the boulevard. And what Olmsted wanted to see is, I tried to label this so you can see where we were. This is Federal and 11th, and then Interlochen Boulevard is coming up. And you can see right there at Federal and Roanoke that there is a concourse. And so he wanted the drive to kind of loop around there. And then if you see those two sort of half arrows, those are the views that he wanted, that's the view corridor that he wanted to be preserved. And that's the one looking out over Lake Washington. And so we sort of got Delmar Delmar Drive. There's the Bagley viewpoint there. But one of the things that interrupted this, not all of it, but the landscape experience is interrupted by the construction of 520. And so hopefully as they do the lid for the new freeway configuration, that intent for that landscape will be somewhat restored. The next one I'll talk about is Boren Park, the viewpoint that is directly across the street from Lakeview Park. And that's, again, another one of those reserving of space for people to enjoy the views over from the hillsides out over the water and out to the mountains. And I should say that there's an actual name for that practice. It's called borrowed landscape. It's when you take a distant landscape and you bring it into a park or a park system design so that it becomes part of the experience that users have. The Boren viewpoint, here's a picture of it in 1975, and it was named in honor of Louisa Boren, one of the members of the Denny Party that established Seattle. And it's an interesting counterpart if you compare it to the view that we'll see when we get to Volunteer Park, which is just nearby, of course. So that's the next park. Volunteer Park was one of the landscapes that was acquired by the city just for city purposes. It was used as a cemetery for a while. It was used for the water system and the reservoir there and the water tower, and it's used as a park. And so it's an example of how land that was already owned by the city, and happily it was located at the top of the hill to take advantage of the elevation for our gravity-fed water system. And so I'm not sure it would have been as easy to acquire all of these hilltop parks if they were not also used for the water system and also had already been acquired for city purposes. And so in 1904, Olmsted comes and does the design on the left, and I'm hoping that the design on the right, that you're able to see it. I'm sorry, I didn't realize it would get cut off by my little picture there. Maybe you can minimize me. But the plan on the left is the first one that he did for Volunteer Park. And Volunteer Park is an interesting park. It is one of the most well developed of the Olmsted plans and one of the most well preserved. That is not surprising considering the neighborhood that it is in, because one of those principles that we talked about is that comprehensive approach, is that this park is designed to accompany the buildings that surround it. He designed it very much in keeping with the parkland, or I'm sorry, the community that surrounded it. This is true of all of the parks if you think of where they are and the role that they play, because another Olmsted principle is that you want each of the parks to have a unique character, so that as people move through the park system, they're not getting just a cookie cutter approach applied to all the parks. So Volunteer Park is the sort of promenading park, the oasis in the middle of the city that has planting beds that are more formal, more symmetrical. Compare that to Woodland Park, which is the zoological gardens, Green Lake, which was originally designed as a boulevard, Seward Park, which is an old growth forest reserved, and then with the views all the way around it out across the lake. And Schmitz Park is not as big, but one of the big parks for West Seattle. He really wanted to protect that for the ravine experience, that original Seattle landscape that had been largely obliterated by that point. And so Volunteer Park has a very formal role. And it's also an interesting look at the orchestration of movement, that principle. He has the drives that go through the park, the concourse along the ridgetop, and the carriage drive that loops through the western part of the park. And then you can see the paths. One of my favorite, and one that has been recently reinstated as part of the work with the Art Museum, is the oval that goes along the east side of the park and really takes you through that entire lawn and grove tree experience. It also has the orchestration of use. The more formal uses, programmed uses, are along the ridge top, along the concourse, and then along the northern part of the park. The rest of the park is reserved for more contemplative uses and experiences in the pastoral landscape, the greensward. And so in 1904, they didn't have enough money to really carry out much of this plan, and they invited Olmsted back in 1909 to do some fine-tuning on the plan and to submit a preliminary plan, and that is when the park was actually developed. And so we have a lot of plans for Volunteer Park. This one is one of my favorites. This is the pergola plan for the pavilion that was right along the concourse. This is where the Seattle Asian Art Museum is today. And you can see that there is a sheltered strip of the pergola, and then to the east, to the right of the pergola, is the concert grove. And that was the original space that Olmsted wanted to have any performances in the park, which was a very popular thing then. He wanted them to be held there in that programmed part of the park. Very quickly, a band shell was proposed because it wasn't very good acoustics and it wasn't very big. And so Olmsted opposed that. He really wanted to keep the passive uses in the exterior parts of the park and the programmed uses in that center part. But he lost that battle, and we have enjoyed as a community the bandstand that was there until 1947, which was followed by a temporary structure, which was then replaced with the amphitheater that we have today that was designed by Rich Haig, and which will soon be replaced with a new amphitheater that the Volunteer Park Trust is working on. I talked a little bit about how the water system co-development with the parks is so important, partly for the acquisition of land, but also for the elements that it could play in the design of park systems. The Olmsted used the reservoirs as water features. As much as they are water facilities, they are also water features. This is that amazing view across the reservoir toward the Olympic Mountains and the Space Needle. And then the water tower there on the right, if you go to the top floor of that, Olmsted helped them locate that to site it. And his idea is that he knew the trees would grow up around the park, and he wanted people to still have access to the views. So he had the observatory placed at the high point of the park on the top of the water tower. And so that's why we have the stairs and the structure that go up to that water tower. The Volunteer Park Trust, and I know lots of other people, are concerned about the decommissioning of this reservoir. It's been delayed for quite some time, but it really is a water feature as much as it is a water facility. And so as the parks, or as Seattle Public Utilities makes their decisions, one of the things that we hope to work on is to keep that as a water feature, regardless of how it's used in the public water system. So, okay, the next one is Lincoln Playfield, also known as Bobby Morris Playfield, Lincoln Park, and of course today as Cal Anderson Park. This is the first preliminary plan. It was interesting when Olmsted talked about the park, because this was land owned by the city, again, because of the water reservoir. The southern part of the park was basically a dirt field that was used by kids for ball fields, impromptu, informal games. And nobody really liked it because it was pretty dusty and muddy and not attractive, but it was undeveloped land owned by the city. And so Olmsted, in his 1903 report, really wanted to see this become a ball field for young kids. But instead, he heard a lot of feedback that no, this should be a more formal park fitting with the residences around it. And so he designed this plan, and you'll see again that central axis down the middle, the trees planted in 2 rows, and it looks out over the reservoir as a water feature. And then it has a pergola at the end, and these crisscrossing paths are to carry people through the park over to the business district from their homes. And so actually, when he submitted that, the Parks Department and the Board of Park Commissioners said, no, we want this to be for children to play in also. So Olmsted said, okay, I can do that. So he redid it. And this is the design that happens is you have a ball field for younger kids. This is not for adults. They didn't have the room for an adult ball field, but they had the smaller field. They have in the middle, they have a wading pool, some sand pits and a lawn with a pergola and a shelter house, which are restrooms. And then you have the reservoir with the promenade walkway around it. And so it's interesting how you can see the park was developed for multiple uses for all different ages. And there's a really great postcard. Here is one of the ball games that's underway at the park, and you can see the reservoir in the distance. And this park did really, really well for a while, and then it started to really struggle in the 1980s. And so when in 1995, the reservoir was going to be put underground because of public safety, the federal government required that reservoirs be put underground. The volunteer park one has not yet had that happen. It's been a long process. And so while that was happening and they realized how much change was going to come to the park, a group called Groundswell for Broadway was formed. And they said that they were formed in response to the community's wish to reclaim and renew the park for a wider range of park users than solely league sports teams, and to help honor its original intent to do so. And so it didn't go terribly smoothly from there. It was a long process of working with public agencies. It's expensive to do these kinds of projects. There was a sense that the park was not developed according to the Olmsted plan, although it was discovered during this process of redeveloping the park that it had in fact been developed according to the Olmsted plan. And so what came out of it is Cal Anderson Park, which was named Kay Rude, who was one of the leaders of Groundswell for off-Broadway. She said the park was named after Cal Anderson. He died of AIDS in 1995, and he was widely praised for his integrity and work ethic and worked tirelessly for the disenfranchised. And so when the park was reopened in 2005, it was renamed in his honor. And Bobby Morris Playfield retains the name of Bobby Morris, who was an extremely popular activities director with the Parks Department. And so what you have in Cal Anderson Park is a new park that is redeveloped according to the original Olmsted design and adapted to current uses. And so it's an interesting hybrid of both a historical park and a new park. So the last one I'll talk about is Miller Playfield, which is over on 19th. And that was a park that was donated by the Miller family in honor of Pendleton Miller, their son, who died very young. And the thing to notice about this particular tract and this plan is you see that there is the developed side on the left, and then the playground in the middle. And then on the two sides, there is vegetation and the steps that come down. It was on a terraced slope. And what that is, an important thing to note about that is that Olmsted really felt that playfields should be functional. They should have these facilities, but they should also have beauty. There should always be an area of a playfield that is reserved for enjoying the landscape. And so if you think of the Del Ridge Playfield, that has a beautiful part of that that's landscaped. If you think of, what's another one? So, Schmitz Park. I'm sorry, not Hiawatha Playfield, up on the top of West Seattle, is another park that has beautiful park-like areas that are more for strolling and enjoying aesthetically than they are for the actual playground facilities. And so what we have is a park system that covers the city, and these Capitol Hill parks are a really important part of that. There is the question of how well developed have they been. We've touched on it a few times. And the life of the park system tells us quite a bit about the current services we have with our park system. Olmsted stopped coming to Seattle after 1913, and the Board of Park Commissioners changed very abruptly in 1914 to all people that had not worked with the Olmsted Brothers firm. And then you see the application of restrictive covenants in the 1920s in new developments and also to some of the older developments that were close to Olmsted parks. And then we have the Great Depression, and then we have World War II. And you have the introduction of redlining and discrimination in who gets loans. And so you start to see a real solidification of the different characters of the neighborhoods and who gets to live where and how well, and it's often associated with the land values of those neighborhoods. And again, there's that back and forth between if there's a well-developed park, the land values tend to be higher. And that Lanier Park generally was zoned for single family housing. And so they reinforced the things that were happening with the redlining and the restrictive covenants. And then the park system itself goes through an interesting change where in 1967, the name of the department is changed to Parks and Recreation. And that reflects something that had been happening already in the 20s and 30s, but really speeds up in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, is that the development of recreational facilities and program spaces became much higher priority and received more funding than things like the vegetation and the landscape parks that are distributed around the city. You also have the addition in 1953 of large swaths of land that are annexed to the city. And so those areas do not have a comprehensive plan for their park system development for many years. And so that leaves them at a disadvantage, particularly as the subdivisions keep growing at a pretty rapid pace. So you can see how the park system that Olmsted intended was realized, but there have been challenges as time has gone on. And one of the things that I like to talk about right at the end, I'm almost done, is that we're not, the Friends of Seattle's Olmsted Parks and the Volunteer Park Trust and other people that care about historic parks are not looking to preserve landscapes in amber. They're not relics that we're holding on to as pieces of the past. Instead, we're looking at protecting those amazing things that we were able to get in Seattle because of Olmsted's vision and the Board of Park Commissioners' decision to bring him here. And so I have a few pictures of just these amazing landscapes that we have in the city. And I'll talk about some of the things that we have that we're able to protect. We have accessibility. Like I said, I can go and enjoy waterfront and I can enjoy views and I can enjoy forests that I would not be able to if we did not have this public park system. And that's true across the city. We have an amazing variety of landscapes. Olmsted's encouragement to develop these parks very differently helped tremendously with the variety of landscapes we have today. And we have a fairly well-distributed open space in our city. The things that we struggle with are that they are very hard to maintain. Vegetation is always growing and changing. The views are often being blocked by volunteer trees. Things grow very well here. And so it's hard to maintain those view corridors. And it's very labor intensive to keep up these landscapes. I came across one source that said Volunteer Park had 23 gardeners. And now there's 1.5 that are assigned to the full-time equivalents, not a half a person, of course. And so that's a pretty enormous expectation for the gardeners who work on maintenance in the parks for what they're able to do to keep the Olmsted intent for vegetation alive and active. There's also issues with invasive species. Ivy, we all know, blackberries, those are very, very hard on maintaining these vegetation belts that Olmsted intended and that the park department would like to maintain. And we also have the issue of population pressure. We've added so much land to our park system over the last 100 years, but it's still not enough. There is still a need for more, and particularly more spaces that can capture that genius of place so that we can distribute people more widely across the park system as they get their recreation. And so I will say that one of the things that has been particularly clever, this is Bicycle Sundays. And this is a way of using Lake Washington Boulevard in a way that maintains vehicular access, which is so important for people that are not able to bike or walk on these parkways, which are a vital part of the overall park experience. But to reserve time when people can really enjoy them at the numbers that would like to enjoy them on those occasional Sundays. And it's very interesting. I encourage you to do the park system or park department survey on the healthy streets that they have been doing during this pandemic, because those have been magical. And to do that carefully so that we don't exclude people that have less accessibility we want to make sure that, and that there are not barriers to these Olmsted assets within the city, but also to find a balance and make sure that people are able to get out and really enjoy our landscapes. So I'll end with that before I go to questions, and I'll just say really quickly, to learn more, there's a book, of course, and there's also HistoryLink.org. That's one of the publishers of the book, with documentary media, and you can go to HistoryLink.org and search Olmsted. You'll find all sorts of great stuff. And then also I encourage you to go to the Friends of Seattle's Olmsted Parks and the Volunteer Park Trust websites. They have great resources, lots of activities. Hopefully very soon we will be getting back to doing guided walking tours. And I'm going to pass it over to Karen, but thank you again so much for coming to this talk. I really appreciate it. Hi, Karen.
Hello. Hi. Hi, I'm Karen Mayada-Allman, and I'm one of the events coordinators at Elliott Bay Book Company. And I was so excited to have this opportunity to host Jennifer, and then the pandemic. So thanks again to Capitol Hill Historical Society, to Jennifer, and also to UW Press for hosting this. So I'm looking for some questions. I don't see any yet, but I'm hoping that we'll have some. One of the things I was noticing as you're talking is as these spaces were envisioned as places of healthy moral development, health in general, and they've shifted to this in this really interesting way during the pandemic as really places to kind of both keep your mind and your body healthy at a time where it's been really hard to get out. And also they continue to be really part of the beating heart of the city in terms of protests. So certainly Pride, the Black Lives Matter CHOP occupation that happened in Cal Anderson Park and also in the playfields, and also that wonderful, the youth march, that Seattle Youth March that marched a couple of thousand people that gathered for teach-in at Volunteer Park and then moved on. So it's really interesting to see how the landscape really supports and embraces to a large degree so many people, even now.
One of the things that Olmsted talked about, Olmsted Senior, was how important parks were as places for people to come together. And I actually, as I watched the CHOP protests and and then there's been gatherings in Volunteer Park also. And then, like you said, all the other times that we come together in our parks, Westlake Park is a place that people come together. Imagine if we didn't have those open spaces, that it's a place where we can go find each other, you know, in all sorts of different ways. And we would be lesser for it if we didn't have those places to gather.
Okay, so we have a question here. Alan says, thank you for your presentation. Some of the trees in the older pictures of Interlochen Park were amazing and huge. Do you know what Olmsted thought about old growth trees versus a more manicured look?
It depended on where he was. It's so interesting looking at his letters. He writes to his wife every day that he's in Seattle. He did that his whole life. And he talked a lot about the trees. And what we find is that if it was a place where it was a less formal landscape, then to as much extent as possible, he wanted those trees kept, and they were selectively logged in order to allow views. And so you see directions he gives for Washington Park is that up on the hills, the ridge, they should selectively take out some of the trees in order to allow views out to the lake, but they should be careful to leave as many as possible. In Seward Park, he calls for leaving as many trees as possible. In Woodland Park, it's really hard to read his letters because Aurora Avenue just drove right through the forest. There used to be a very dense, lush forest in that midsection of the park, and it's still there, But it has been one of those that is loved to death a little bit, and figuring out how to restore that landscape is very tricky. I also just have to throw in that there's a really interesting letter where he talks about the Highlands. He's laying out one of the landscapes for a home in the Highlands. And he writes to Sophie, his wife, that he can't believe they want to take out all the salal and put in lawn, because he thinks the salal is so much more beautiful and it makes that lovely rustling noise. He calls it, it sounds like fresh linen. And so it's sort of what we're doing now, where we're replacing lawns with native vegetation. And he was wishing that he could convince people, but he never successfully did. So, and then in a park like Volunteer Park, he wanted the ornamentals in the planting beds, but he also picked native plants to go in those planting beds. Oregon grape was one of his favorites, the mahonias. And so it's really interesting. He fell in love with our native vegetation.
Okay, we have a question about redlining. When did redlining begin to happen, and how did that affect Olmsted's parks?
So the redlining was, if you're talking about just the policies of the loans and where houses would be, I am embarrassed to say that that fact has gone out of my head, but I do know that it is after the 20s. It is after Olmsted is, I'm sorry, after the teens, after Olmsted is here. And so the effect is more on who gets to live where. And what we see in the parks is that once the redlining and the covenants get more entrenched, you see more people writing letters to the Board of Park Commissioners asking for people to be excluded. And specifically, the one that comes to mind is Mount Baker Park. The Mount Baker community, they wrote a letter to the Board of Park Commissioners asking them to exclude Japanese Americans from the park, from swimming at the park. The Board of Park Commissioners declined to do so, which I'm glad to read that, but still, the idea was pursued pretty enthusiastically for a while by the residents. And so I see the effect on the parks is that it's sort of the idea that there's no specific rule saying such and such a person cannot go into Mount Baker Park in the 1930s, but they certainly were made to feel like they were not welcome if they were not white. And so that has an impact on the park system as a whole and the role that it's playing in the community, because while I would not say that Olmsted did not hold racist views, he certainly did. I would say that he did intend, and he said over and over and over again, that the parks are for everyone, that everyone needs the parks. And so I never saw anywhere where he specifically called for a park to be exclusionary, but I also did not see anywhere where he specifically spoke out against that. So he did die in 1920, and so it's complicated, but it's not that complicated. It doesn't mean there isn't a letter out there somewhere, but I have never seen it where he specifically called for integration or equal access to parks.
I have a question about the lowering of Lake Washington. How did that impact the parks?
That's actually a really great story. So Olmsted, when he was here in 1903, knew that the lake was going to be lowered. As we talk about in the Waterway book, it took a long time. It was very much a Seattle process to get the ship canal built. But everyone knew that once it was built and the Montlake Cut was made, that the lake would be lowered and that land would be exposed. And the state sold some of that land, the shorelands, in order to finance the Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition. But one of the things that got written into the legislation at the suggestion of Olmsted was that any shoreland that was adjacent to city-owned land would be automatically transferred to city ownership at no cost. And so some of the subdivision owners alongside the property owners alongside the lake donated strips of land so that along Lake Washington Boulevard, the land that was exposed would automatically become parkland. So they donated some of their land in order to get the park adjacent to their development, which of course meant that their land would be more valuable because it would have this park next to it and it would have direct access to the Parkway, but also that it was the only way that they would ever be able to afford the city purchasing that land. It just wasn't feasible for that many acres. And so that's why you have the boulevard alongside the lake at all. And then when the lake was lowered, you get that whole park land that's exposed by the water declining.
I have a question about the brown signs that indicate the road as part of the Olmsted plan. Can you tell us something about that? history.
Yes, so the Friends of Seattle's Olmsted Parks, that was a big project that they did. The brand signs, they are sometimes not Olmsted Parkways. It's been used a little bit more broadly than that, but basically they indicate to you when you are on a street that was intended to be part of the Olmsted Park system, and importantly, is still owned by the park department. SDOT manages curb to curb for safety and maintenance, but the right-of-way along those is owned by the Parks Department. There's a lot of encroachment. That's a big issue, but it does give us that public access for the landscaping. And so that falls under that expense. It is incredibly expensive to maintain that length of vegetation and manage it for all the things it needs to be managed for. But it's this amazing gift that we have these stripes of parkland all through the city.
Okay. And I have a question about the cemetery and the relationship between Volunteer Park and the cemetery.
So the reason that the cemetery and the park are adjacent is that when Denny Park was first donated to the city, it was a cemetery in the 1860s and 1870s. And then in 1884, the Denny family who had donated it decided to plat their remaining land around it, and they wanted it to be a park and not a cemetery. And so they exhumed all the bodies and they distributed them all over the place. There's a really cool book in the Seattle City Archives that tells where all the different bodies were sent. But quite a number of them were sent up to what is now Volunteer Park, was then just city-owned land, in order to be reinterred there. And then a few years later, they decided, no, this is actually a perfect place for a park. Let's hoist them out of there again. They disinterred them and again sent them in different directions, but one of the places they went was that they just established Lakeview Cemetery to the north there, excuse me. And so then it became a park. And so Olmsted wasn't thrilled with the view into the cemetery, and so that is one of the reasons that he put those programmed uses up there, the playground and the yard and the greenhouses up there.
I have a question about how Olmsted came up with his principles. Where did you find his inspiration?
So it was Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. and Calvert Vaux, but primarily Olmsted, who are responsible for developing those concepts. And then John Olmsted worked with him over his first few decades of his career. And they draw on influences from Europe, from European gardens, particularly in England. They draw on Alexander Downing's work, who is an American landscape architect. And it's sort of just by the application of his life experiences and his experience in those landscapes that develops his ideas for American landscape architecture principles. If you're interested in that, there are several biographies of Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. that are absolutely fascinating. He led an amazing life.
A question about any further movement on restoring the Sunset Boulevard in Volunteer Park.
Oh, the Sunset Promenade. Yeah, so that will be part of whatever decision gets made with the reservoir decommissioning. So there's two things that could happen. One, it will be taken out of the parks, the water system entirely, because we actually, as a city, use less water per capita than we used to, and so we may not need it. But if they do decide they need it, then it will need to be placed underground. It's no longer possible to have water that goes into the water system be exposed to potential contaminants. And so that will, whenever that decision is made, and right now it's so uncertain, the latest concern is with climate change. How will that affect rainfall, and will it be needed as a storage facility? Even if it's not necessarily always being used in the park system, but if we get more water as rainwater, will we need to hold more of that in the city rather than in the reservoir in the Cedar River watershed? And so once that decision gets made, then the process will start of whatever changes are made, and then we can hope to have some of the volunteer trees that have grown up on the western side of the reservoir removed, and the planting beds that were intended for that area reinstalled. And so then you will get better views out across the west on the side there.
Okay, and we have time for, I think, one more question, and that is, how and why was Volunteer Park, why did Volunteer Park get its name?
That is really interesting. So there's actually a memorial in the park that tells that story, not very well, but the short answer is that it was named in honor of the volunteer soldiers who went to fight in the Spanish-American War, which was one of the incidents of American imperialism in the early 19th century, or the early 20th century. And so I say that the marker doesn't do the job very well, is because it says that the people of Cuba, the Philippines, and Haiti were liberated. And that, of course, isn't the whole story at all. And the soldiers didn't necessarily liberate the people. They liberated themselves eventually from imperialism. And so it's of its time. It's this whole argument we're having all across the United States. It's not as hostile as some that you see out there, but it is definitely worth having a conversation about. And the trust, the Volunteer Park Trust, is part of a discussion that is underway about that. And the reason that it's problematic to me is that if it's a public park, it's really important that there's nothing in that park that makes anyone feel unwelcome. And this isn't a huge jab, but it is a jab, and it makes people feel uncomfortable and unwelcome. And so I think that it's worth having a discussion about.
Okay, so thank you very much. If you enjoyed this presentation, we are going to be back on July 14th at 6 p.m. for the virtual book launch for Walking the High Desert. And it's a reading and Q&A with author Ellen Waterston. And this is also published and produced with University of Washington Press. On August 16th, there's our long postponed event for Hill with the Future, which is History of Seattle's Capitol Hill, with author Jacqueline Williams, and also a panel. It was republished by Capitol Hill Historical Society last year, so we're excited about that. Elliott Bay will also be presenting some events about nature, how to access nature in Seattle's urban environment, with Landa Lynn Haupt, David Williams, and also Joey Manson, who's the center director at the Seward Park Audubon Center. So if you'd like a copy of Olmsted in Seattle, we have them at Elliott Bay. You can also order them from your favorite bookstore near you. Jennifer Ott is glad to sign some books for you. So if you want to order a book, go to our website and order it from our website. We have curbside pickup and also mail order. And you can request a signed book and even an inscribed book. So please do that if you feel so moved. And I hope you'll check out her book. So thank you very much to Jennifer, to Tom, and also to Kate from University of Washington Press for moderating today and for setting up this talk. And thank all of you for attending. Hope to see you at another event soon.
Well, thank you so much.